The first time Caleb Draven walked into that trading post, everyone knew he was hunting for a wife. What they didn't expect was who he'd choose, not the beautiful sister, the one men crossed territories to glimpse. No, he wanted the other one, the forgotten daughter who'd been invisible her whole life. The decision tore a family apart and sent shockwaves through an entire settlement. But in the brutal Wyoming wilderness, beauty doesn't keep you alive. Strength does. This is the story of a woman who learned her worth from the last man anyone expected to see it. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind cut through Fort Bridger like a blade, carrying dust and the smell of unwashed bodies. Mara Hale stood at the wash basin behind the trading post, her hands raw and red from lye soap, scrubbing someone else's dirt from fabric that would never be hers. 26 years old, and this was her life. Bent over buckets while younger women preened in parlors. "Mara!" Her mother's voice cracked through the thin walls. "Get in here. Now!" She dried her hands on her apron, already anticipating the complaint. The stew wasn't seasoned right, or she'd hung the washing wrong, or she'd failed in some other invisible way that her sister Lydia never seemed to manage. Mara pushed through the back door into the cramped living quarters that smelled of tallow and disappointment. Her mother, Catherine Hale, stood rigid in the center of the room. Lydia sat by the window in a pool of afternoon light that made her blonde hair shine like honey. She was 19, beautiful in that careless way that came from never doubting it, and she was crying. "What happened?" Mara asked. "What happened?" Catherine's voice pitched high. "What happened is that a trapper came through this morning with furs worth more than we've seen in 6 months. A man of means, Mara. Substantial means." Mara waited. There was more. "He's looking for a wife," Lydia said through her tears. But they weren't sad tears. They were the glittering kind, excited and terrified at once. "He saw me this morning when Papa was negotiating the pelts. He asked Papa who I was." "Congratulations," Mara said flatly. "Don't use that tone with me," Catherine snapped. "This is important. This man could save this family. Your father's lungs are getting worse. We can barely keep this post running. If Lydia marries well, then we're all saved," Mara finished. "I understand." "Do you?" Catherine's eyes were hard. "Because you're going to help make sure this happens. You're going to make certain your sister looks perfect tonight. He's coming for supper." Mara glanced at Lydia, who had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "I'm sure she'll be fine without my help." "Your sister needs support from her family," Catherine said, and what she meant was, "Your sister is the only valuable thing we have, so don't ruin it." Mara had heard it her whole life in 1,000 different ways. Lydia was the prize. Mara was the workhorse. Their father, Thomas, had stopped pretending otherwise years ago when it became clear that Mara had inherited his broad shoulders and practical face instead of her mother's delicate features. She was useful. Lydia was marriageable. Those were the roles set in stone before Mara was old enough to argue. "Fine," Mara said. "What do you need?" The afternoon dissolved into preparation. Mara hauled water for Lydia's bath, heated irons for her hair, and stitched a torn seam in the blue dress Catherine had been saving for exactly this kind of opportunity. Through it all, Lydia chattered nervously. "Papa says he lives up in the mountains," Lydia said while Mara pinned her hair. "Traps beaver and marten. Apparently he comes down twice a year with enough furs to make the trip worth it." "Sounds isolated," Mara said. "Sounds profitable." Catherine was laying out the good plates. 3 of them had chips, but they'd have to do. A man who can pull those kinds of returns isn't struggling. He's smart. Or lucky. "Don't be negative," Catherine said. "Lydia, remember to laugh at his jokes. Men like that. And sit up straight. And for heaven's sake, let him talk. Men like to hear themselves think out loud." Mara listened to the familiar litany of advice. All the things a woman should do to make a man comfortable, to make herself smaller and more palatable. She'd heard it directed at Lydia for years, and never once at herself. No one bothered coaching Mara because no one expected her to need it. By the time the sun started to set, Lydia looked like something out of a painting. The blue dress brought out her eyes. Her hair fell in careful ringlets. Even her nervous energy read as charming rather than anxious. "Perfect," Catherine breathed. "You're perfect." Lydia caught Mara's eye in the mirror. "Do I really look all right?" "You look beautiful," Mara said, and meant it. You always do. Something complicated crossed Lydia's face, but before she could respond, they heard boots on the porch. Heavy, deliberate steps. Catherine's hands flew to her hair, and Lydia stood so fast she nearly knocked over the stool. Positions, Catherine hissed, which meant Lydia should sit demurely and Mara should make herself useful elsewhere. Mara moved toward the kitchen area as Thomas opened the door. The man who entered had to duck under the frame. Caleb Draven was not what Mara expected. Most trappers who came through the fort were either grizzled old survivors or young idiots who wouldn't last a winter. This man was somewhere in his middle 30s, built like he'd been carved from the same granite as the mountains he lived in. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples, pulled back in a way that suggested function over fashion. His face was weathered, but not unkind. Sharp features, a nose that had been broken at least once, and eyes that took in everything with an unsettling directness. He wore buckskin that had seen use but wasn't filthy, and he moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned not to waste energy. "Mr. Draven," Thomas said, extending his hand. "Welcome. Appreciate the invitation." His voice was deep, roughened by weather or disuse. He shook Thomas's hand, nodded to Catherine, and then his gaze swept the room. It landed on Lydia first, as everyone's did. She had arranged herself perfectly by the window, backlit and lovely. Then his eyes moved to Mara. She froze with a pot in her hands, halfway to the table, suddenly conscious of her work dress and her hair that had come loose from its braid, and her hands that were still red from the wash basin. His gaze held for a moment, assessing, but not in the way men usually looked at her, which was to confirm she wasn't worth looking at. Then he looked back at Thomas. "Smells good," he said. Catherine had outdone herself, or rather, had forced Mara to outdo herself. Venison stew with actual vegetables, bread that was only 1 day old, and dried apple compote that was their last jar from 2 summers ago. It was the best meal they could manage, and everyone at the table knew it was a performance. Caleb sat across from Lydia, with Thomas at the head of the table and Catherine beside her daughter. Mara served, playing her assigned role of helpful shadow. "So, Mr. Draven," Catherine began, her voice dripping sweetness. "Thomas tells me you've been trapping in the Wind River Range?" "Yes, ma'am." "That must be terribly difficult work." "It's work," he agreed. Catherine waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. She pushed forward. "And dangerous, I imagine. All alone up there." "Can be," Lydia tried next, leaning forward just enough. "Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes." It was like watching someone try to draw water from a stone. Caleb answered every question with the minimum possible words, his attention on his food more than the conversation. It wasn't that he was rude. He maintained eye contact. He responded when spoken to, but he wasn't playing the game Catherine had set up. Mara refilled his coffee and caught the briefest flicker of acknowledgement, a slight nod that felt more genuine than anything else he'd offered. Thomas, perhaps sensing the struggle, changed tactics. "The pelts you brought in were fine quality. Beaver's getting harder to find in these parts." "Have to go deeper," Caleb said. "Higher up. The easy territory's been trapped out." "That's good business sense." Thomas's approval was obvious. "Most men stay where it's comfortable and wonder why their hauls get smaller. Comfort doesn't pay." "No," Thomas agreed. "It doesn't." For the first time that evening, something like respect passed between two men. Catherine, sensing an opportunity, pressed. "It sounds like you've built quite a life for yourself up there, Mr. Draven. A successful life." "Successful enough." "But incomplete, perhaps." She smiled. "A man in your position must think about settling down, having a family." The directness of it made even Lydia wince, but Caleb didn't react. He set down his fork, took a drink of coffee, and looked directly at Catherine. "That's why I'm here," he said. Catherine's smile widened. Lydia sat up straighter. Thomas nodded approvingly. "I'm too old to be dancing around things," Caleb continued. "I live 3 days hard ride from the nearest settlement. Winter lasts 8 months. The closest neighbor is 2 valleys over, and he's half crazy from isolation. It's brutal work and a hard life, and I need a partner who can handle it." "Of course," Catherine said. "A wife should be a helpmate to her husband." "More than that," Caleb said. "I don't need someone to keep house while I'm gone for weeks at a time. I need someone who can work a trap line, who can shoot straight, who won't fall apart when things get dangerous. Because they will get dangerous. That's not a possibility. It's a guarantee. The room had gone very quiet. I can offer stability, Caleb said. Financial security, protection, a partnership. But I can't offer easy. Anyone who comes with me needs to understand that. Naturally, Catherine said, though her smile had tightened, Lydia is a very capable young woman. I'm sure she is. Lydia's cheeks flushed prettily, but Mara, still standing in the shadows by the kitchen, saw something in Caleb's expression that didn't match his words. He looked at Lydia the way someone might look at a fine piece of china, appreciatively, but with no intention of taking it camping. You're very beautiful, Caleb said directly to Lydia, and the girl's breath caught. I'm sure you have plenty of suitors. She does, Catherine said quickly, but none with prospects as solid as yours, Mr. Draven. I'm flattered. He paused. But I don't think I'm what she needs. The words landed like stones in water. Catherine's smile froze. Thomas's eyebrows shot up. Lydia looked like she'd been slapped. I don't understand, Catherine said carefully. Your daughter is lovely, Caleb said, and he sounded sincere. But she's built for a different kind of life than what I'm offering. She should have that life. Dances and neighbors and a town within walking distance. Not months of isolation and work that'll scar her hands. I'm stronger than I look, Lydia said, her voice small. I believe you. Caleb's tone was gentle. But strength isn't just about will. It's about experience, preparation. I need someone who already knows how to survive, not someone who will have to learn while their life depends on it. Mara's hands had stilled on the coffee pot. She knew she should move, should refill cups or clear plates or do something useful, but she couldn't stop watching this man dismantle her family's plans with brutal honesty. Catherine had recovered enough to rally. Mr. Draven, I assure you Lydia is more capable than you might think. I'm sure she is, Caleb interrupted, not unkindly. But I'm not looking for potential. I'm looking for proven. Then perhaps you should have been clearer about your requirements before accepting our hospitality, Catherine said, her sweetness curdling into ice. You're right, Caleb said. I should have. I apologize for wasting your time. He started to stand, and Thomas, clearly flustered, tried to salvage something. Now, let's not be hasty. Perhaps if you spent more time getting to know Lydia, I don't think more time would change what I see, Caleb said. He looked at Lydia again. You deserve someone who wants the life you want. I'm not that person. Then his eyes shifted to Mara. What about you? He said. The room went silent for an entirely different reason. Mara's throat went dry. I'm sorry? You've been working since I got here, Caleb said. Serving, cleaning, managing the meal. Earlier today I saw you hauling water like it was nothing. Your hands... He nodded at them. Those are working hands. Catherine found her voice. Mr. Draven, Mara is... She's not... I'm asking her, Caleb said, his eyes still on Mara. Not you. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every eye in the room was on her, and she felt the weight of her mother's horror, her sister's confusion, her father's shock. I don't understand the question, Mara said carefully. It's simple, Caleb said. Would you consider marrying me? Lydia made a sound like she'd been punched. Catherine's face went white, then red. Thomas looked between his daughters like he couldn't process what was happening. Mara's first instinct was to laugh, because surely this was a joke. Surely this man wasn't standing in her family's home, turning down her beautiful sister to propose to the spinster daughter nobody wanted. But he wasn't laughing. You don't know me, Mara said. I know enough, Caleb replied. I know you work hard without complaining. I know you're strong enough to do heavy labor. I know you're not afraid of getting your hands dirty. That's more than most people can show me in an evening. This is insane, Catherine said. She's 26 years old. She's never been courted. She has no experience with being chosen. Caleb's gaze flicked to Catherine, sharp as a knife. Maybe that's because people have been looking at the wrong things. How dare you? I dare because I'm the one making the offer, Caleb said, his voice level but firm. And I'm making it to Mara. She can accept or refuse. That's her choice. But it's not yours. The room felt like it might explode. Mara stood frozen, her mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once. This couldn't be real. Men didn't choose her. Men didn't even see her. She was the backup, the leftover, the one who'd resigned herself to spinsterhood years ago. And yet here was this stranger, this mountain of a man, looking at her like she was the only person in the room worth considering. "I need to think," Mara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fair enough," Caleb said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather pouch, setting it on the table. "I'm staying at the fort for 3 more days. If you want to talk more, come find me. If not, I'll leave you be." He nodded to Thomas, ignored Catherine completely, and walked out. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. Then Catherine erupted. "What did you do?" She rounded on Mara with fury in her eyes. "What did you do to make him think?" "I didn't do anything," Mara's voice cracked. "I was serving dinner." "She probably threw herself at him," Lydia said, her voice thick with tears. "While the rest of us were trying to be proper, I didn't throw myself at anyone," Mara shouted, and the volume of her own voice startled her. She never shouted. "I didn't say anything to him. I barely looked at him." "Well, you must have done something," Catherine hissed, "because that man just humiliated this entire family by rejecting Lydia for you." The words hit like a physical blow. Mara looked at her sister, who was crying in earnest now, mascara running down her perfect face. She looked at her mother, whose expression was pure venom. She looked at her father, who wouldn't meet her eyes. "I'm going to bed," Mara said quietly. "You're going to turn him down," Catherine said. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to find that man and tell him you're not interested. You're going to make this right." "Make it right for who?" The words slipped out before Mara could stop them. "For your sister," Catherine said, like it was obvious. "For this family. Or do you really think you could survive up in those mountains? You'd be dead inside a month, and then where would we be?" Mara looked at her mother for a long moment. At the woman who'd spent 26 years making sure Mara knew her place, knew her value, knew exactly how much of a disappointment she was. "I said I need to think," Mara repeated. Then she walked to the small room she shared with Lydia and closed the door. She didn't sleep. How could she? Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Caleb's face, heard his voice saying those impossible words. "Would you consider marrying me?" Like it was a real question. Like she was a real option. Lydia came to bed hours later, her crying finally spent, and didn't say a word. The silence between them was thick with years of comparison and competition that Mara had never asked for, but had always lost. When dawn broke, Mara was already awake. She dressed in her most practical clothes, a wool skirt that had been mended a dozen times, a work blouse, her sturdy boots. She braided her hair tight and looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror on the wall. Plain face, broad shoulders, strong hands. Not beautiful, but maybe, according to one man at least, enough. She found Caleb at the fort stable, checking over his horses. He looked up when she approached, no surprise in his expression, like he'd been expecting her. "I have questions," Mara said without preamble. "Ask them." "Why me?" "I told you." "No," Mara interrupted. "Not the practical reasons. I understand those. But you could find a dozen women with working hands if that's all you needed. So why me, specifically?" Caleb set down the bridle he'd been inspecting and leaned against the stable wall, considering her. "You want the honest answer?" "I wouldn't have asked otherwise. Because when I watched you last night, I didn't see someone performing. Your mother and sister, they were playing parts. The gracious hostess, the perfect daughter. But you were just working, no pretense. And when your mother talked, you didn't argue, but I saw it in your face. You disagreed. You have opinions you don't bother sharing because no one's listening anyway." Mara's throat tightened. "I need a partner," Caleb continued, "not an ornament, not someone who'll need protecting every time the wind shifts. I need someone who can think, who can work, who won't fall apart when things get hard. You look like someone who's been handling hard for a long time." "That's not exactly romantic." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But it's real. And real lasts longer than romantic when you're snowed in for months." Mara crossed her arms. "My family expects me to refuse you." "I figured." They think I'm going to humiliate myself trying to survive your life. They think I'll die up there. Might, Caleb said with brutal honesty. Might not, but you'll definitely die down here, just slower. I've seen it. People who wake up at 50 and realize they spent their whole life making everyone else comfortable while they disappeared. The word struck something deep inside her, some truth she'd never let herself acknowledge. Tell me about this life you're offering, Mara said. The real version. Not the version you'd tell my father. Caleb's expression shifted, something like respect flickering through. All right, my cabin is 3 rooms, built solid but nothing fancy. It's a full day's work to keep it running, cutting wood, hauling water, maintaining supplies. Winter snows us in from October to May. We'd be completely alone except for the occasional trading run. The work is constant. Checking trap lines means hiking miles in weather that can kill you if you're not careful. We'd be processing pelts, preserving meat, staying ahead of starvation and cold. There's no neighbors to call on, no town to escape to. If something goes wrong, we handle it ourselves, or we die. You're not selling it well, Mara said. I'm not trying to sell it, Caleb replied. I'm telling you what it is. If you come with me, you need to know what you're accepting. And what am I accepting exactly? What would this marriage look like? Partnership, Caleb said. I won't lie and say I love you. I don't know you well enough for that. But I respect what I've seen, and respect's a better foundation than infatuation. We'd work together, survive together, build something together. I won't order you around like property, but I won't coddle you either. You'd have equal say in decisions, but you'd also have equal responsibility for consequences. What about... Mara hesitated. What about the other parts of marriage? Caleb's expression didn't change. I won't force anything. We'd figure that out as we go, at whatever pace makes sense. I'm looking for a partner first. Everything else is secondary. It was the most honest conversation about marriage Mara had ever heard. No poetry, no promises of eternal devotion, no fairy tale ending. Just the raw reality of what life together would actually mean. I need 1 more day, Mara said. Take it, Caleb said. But Mara, don't make this decision for your family. Don't refuse because they want you to, and don't accept because you think you owe them something. This is your life. Choose for yourself. She nodded and walked away, her mind churning. The trading post felt different when she returned. Catherine wouldn't look at her. Lydia stayed in their room. Thomas was the only one who acknowledged her presence. Your mother wants you to refuse him, Thomas said quietly while they worked inventory. I know. She thinks you'll embarrass us. I know that too. Thomas was quiet for a moment. What do you think? Mara looked at her father, surprised. He'd never asked her opinion on anything important before. I think... She stopped, trying to find the right words. I think I've spent my whole life being useful, making sure everyone else was taken care of, and nobody's ever asked what I wanted or needed. Not once. And what do you want? I want to matter, Mara said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. I want someone to see me as more than just the help. I want to build something that's mine. Thomas nodded slowly. Then you should probably take that man's offer. What about Mother? What about Lydia? Your mother will be angry for a while, Thomas said. She'll get over it. She always does. And Lydia, he sighed, Lydia needs to learn that being beautiful doesn't guarantee anything. Maybe this will teach her that. She's going to hate me. Probably, Thomas agreed, but she'll find someone else. Beauty like hers always does. You, though, when do you think you'll get another chance like this? Never, Mara thought. The answer was never. That night, Mara made her decision. She found Caleb the next morning at the fort's small restaurant, eating breakfast alone. She slid into the seat across from him. I'll marry you, she said. But I have conditions. Caleb set down his coffee. I'm listening. I want to learn everything, trapping, shooting, tracking, all of it. I won't be dead weight. Agreed. I want equal say in major decisions. If we're partners, we're actually partners. Fair? And if this doesn't work, if we get up there and realize we made a mistake, I want your word you'll help me get somewhere safe. I won't be trapped. Caleb extended his hand across the table. You have my word. On all of it. Mara looked at his hand. calloused, scarred, strong. She thought about her mother's face when she heard this news. She thought about Lydia's tears. She thought about spending the rest of her life in this trading post, washing other people's clothes and fading into invisibility. Then she thought about mountains she'd never seen, and work that mattered, and a man who looked at her like she was capable of something more. She took his hand. "When do we leave?" she asked. 2 weeks, Caleb said. "That gives us time to get supplies, make it legal, and prepare you for what's coming." "I'll be ready." The next 2 weeks were chaos. Catherine refused to speak to her. Lydia oscillated between crying and cold fury. But Thomas, surprisingly, helped. He gave her his best winter coat, taught her what supplies she'd actually need, and on the day before the wedding pulled her aside. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "I know I never said that before. Should have. You've always been strong, Mara, stronger than any of us gave you credit for." It was the first time she could remember her father saying anything like that, and it made her eyes burn. The wedding was small, just the two of them and a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. Catherine and Lydia didn't attend. Thomas stood as witness, his expression unreadable. When the preacher pronounced them married, Caleb kissed her briefly, a formality, not a promise. But his hand was steady on hers, and that felt like something. They left the next morning before dawn. Mara tied her few possessions onto the pack horse Caleb had brought for her, wearing pants for the first time in her life because Caleb had insisted skirts would get her killed on the trail. Her mother had called her shameful. Mara had called it practical. As they rode out of Fort Bridger, Mara looked back once. The trading post was already fading into the morning mist, and with it, everything she'd ever known. Every expectation, every limitation, every small box they'd tried to keep her in. Ahead was nothing but wilderness and uncertainty, and a man she barely knew. Mara turned forward and didn't look back again. The mountains were waiting. The first day on the trail, Mara learned that everything she thought she knew about hardship was laughably inadequate. They rode for 12 hours straight with only brief stops to water the horses. Her thighs screamed from gripping the saddle. Her back ached from the unfamiliar posture. And by the time Caleb finally called a halt near a creek bed, Mara could barely swing her leg over to dismount. She hit the ground harder than intended, her knees buckling. Caleb caught her elbow to steady her. "You'll adjust," he said. "Takes about a week." "A week?" Mara repeated, trying not to sound as miserable as she felt. "Maybe 2 for you, since you haven't ridden much." He said it matter-of-factly, already moving to unsaddle his horse. "Start with yours. I'll get the gear." Mara's hand shook as she worked the buckles. Her fingers were clumsy with exhaustion, and the leather straps seemed deliberately designed to frustrate her. She heard Caleb setting up camp behind her, the efficient sounds of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, and felt her inadequacy like a weight on her chest. By the time she got her horse unsaddled, Caleb had already erected a basic shelter, started a fire, and begun unpacking their supplies. He glanced at her, taking in her trembling hands and the way she could barely stand. "Eat," he said, handing her jerky and hardtack. "Then sleep. You're no good to me if you collapse." It wasn't comforting, but it was honest. Mara ate mechanically, too tired to taste anything, and when Caleb pointed to the bedroll he'd laid out near the fire, she didn't argue. She was asleep before she could wonder where he'd sleep. She woke before dawn to find Caleb already moving, the camp half-packed. Her whole body felt like one giant bruise. "Up," Caleb said, not unkindly. "We need to make the pass before the weather turns." And so began the pattern. Ride until Mara thought she'd fall off the horse. Stop briefly. Ride again. Every muscle she owned protested, but she gritted her teeth and kept going because the alternative was admitting she couldn't handle this, and she'd rather die than prove her mother right. On the 3rd day, it rained. Not the gentle spring showers Mara remembered from the fort, but a cold, driving rain that soaked through her coat in minutes and turned the trail to mud. The horses struggled for footing. Water ran down Mara's neck, into her boots, until she was shivering so hard her teeth chattered. Caleb kept riding. "Shouldn't we stop?" Mara called over the downpour. "And do what?" Caleb shouted back. "Rain doesn't care if we're comfortable. We keep moving, or we freeze." So they kept moving. By the time they made camp that night, Mara's hands were so numb she couldn't work the buttons on her coat. Caleb built the fire while she stood there uselessly, dripping and shaking. Get those wet clothes off, he said, not looking at her. There's dry ones in your pack. Mara's brain felt sluggish from cold. She fumbled with her pack, fingers refusing to cooperate, and Caleb finally strode over with an exasperated sound. Here, he said, opening it for her and pulling out dry clothes. Change. Behind the shelter if you want privacy, but do it fast. Hypothermia will kill you quicker than modesty will save you. She changed with shaking hands, her wet clothes clinging stubbornly, and when she emerged, Caleb had hot coffee waiting. She took it gratefully, wrapping both hands around the tin cup. Better? He asked. I thought I was going to die, Mara admitted. You weren't close, Caleb said. But you need to learn the difference between uncomfortable and dangerous. Rain is uncomfortable. Staying in wet clothes when the temperature drops is dangerous. You have to know which is which. How do I learn that? By listening when I tell you. He poured his own coffee, settling beside the fire. And by paying attention. This isn't the fort, Mara. Nature doesn't give second chances. She nodded, too tired to argue, and they sat in silence while the fire crackled and the rain drummed on their makeshift shelter. You did better than I expected today, Caleb said after a while. Mara looked at him, surprised. I could barely hold the reins by the end. But you held them, Caleb said. You didn't complain. You didn't ask to turn back. That counts for something. It was the closest thing to praise she'd gotten from him, and it warmed her more than the coffee. On the 5th day, they reached the first real climb. The trail, if it could even be called that, wound up a rocky slope that seemed to go straight into the sky. Mara stared at it, her stomach dropping. We're going up that? Horses can't make it, Caleb said. We walk from here. Lead them carefully. Watch where you step. The climb took hours. Mara's legs burned, her lungs screamed, and several times she had to stop and lean against a boulder just to keep from passing out. Caleb waited without comment each time, his own breathing barely elevated, and Mara hated how easy this seemed for him. Halfway up, her horse balked at a narrow section. The trail was barely wider than the animal, with a steep drop on one side and sheer rock on the other. Easy, Caleb said, moving past her. Let me. But Mara's pride, stubborn and stupid, flared. I can handle it. Mara, I said I can handle it. She tugged the reins, trying to coax the horse forward, but the animal was spooked, and she was too inexperienced to calm it properly. The horse tossed its head, hooves dancing dangerously close to the edge. Caleb was there in an instant, shouldering Mara aside and taking the reins with practiced confidence. He spoke low to the horse, his voice steady and calm, and within moments had the animal moving forward again. When they reached safer ground, he turned to Mara with something hard in his expression. Don't do that again, he said. I know what you were trying to do, Caleb interrupted. Prove yourself, I get it. But pride gets people killed in places like this. If I tell you to let me handle something, it's because I know what I'm doing, and you don't. That's not an insult. That's reality. Mara's face burned with shame and anger. So I'm just supposed to stand aside and let you do everything? No, Caleb said. You're supposed to learn. Watch what I do. Ask questions. But don't risk your life or the horses, because you're too stubborn to admit you need help. He was right, which made it worse. Mara swallowed her retort and nodded stiffly. They didn't speak much for the rest of that day. That night, though, Caleb sat her down by the fire and walked her through the proper way to handle a spooked horse. He showed her the signals to watch for, the voice tone that worked, the body language that communicated calm. He was patient in a way that surprised her, repeating things when she didn't understand, correcting without condescension. Why are you taking the time to teach me this? Mara asked. Caleb looked at her like it was a strange question. Because you need to know it. Next time I might not be right there. You could have just picked someone who already knew. Probably, Caleb agreed. But I didn't want someone who already knew. I wanted someone who could learn. What's the difference? People who already know everything stop paying attention, Caleb said. They get complacent. You're starting from zero, which means you're still cautious, still aware of what you don't know. That'll keep you alive longer than false confidence. It was a strange kind of compliment, but Mara took it as one. On the 8th day, they reached the cabin. Mara's first thought was that it was smaller than she'd imagined. Her second was that it was more solid. Caleb hadn't been lying when he said he'd built it well. The logs were tight-fitted, the roof looked sound, and the whole structure had an air of permanence that surprised her. "Home," Caleb said, dismounting, "for better or worse." Mara slid off her horse, her legs steadier now after a week of riding, and followed him inside. The interior was sparse but functional. One main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies. A door led to what looked like a sleeping area, and another to a small storage room packed with furs and equipment. "It's not much," Caleb said, watching her take it in. "It's more than I expected," Mara said honestly. She'd half imagined a lean-to and a prayer. This was an actual home. "We'll need to winterize before the first snow," Caleb said, already moving into planning mode. "Chinking needs checking, firewood needs cutting and stacking, supplies need inventory, and you need training. Lots of it. When do we start?" "Tomorrow," Caleb said. "Tonight, we rest." But rest didn't mean relaxation. After they'd unloaded the horses and settled them in the small stable Caleb had built, there was still dinner to make, gear to organize, and a dozen small tasks that needed doing. Mara helped where she could, trying to learn the rhythm of this place, this life. They ate in near silence, venison stew that Caleb made from dried meat, and root vegetables stored in the cellar. It was simple but filling, and Mara was too hungry to care about anything else. "You'll sleep in there," Caleb said, nodding to the bedroom. "I'll take the main room for now." Mara looked at him, confused. "We're married." "We are," Caleb agreed. "But like I said at the fort, we'll figure that out as we go. No rush." It should have been a relief, but instead Mara felt a strange sort of uncertainty. Was he having regrets? Did he look at her now, after a week on the trail, and see all the ways she fell short? "Did I do something wrong?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Caleb's eyebrows rose. "No, why would you think that?" Mara struggled for words. "I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, or what you expect." Caleb set down his spoon and looked at her fully. "I expect you to learn what you need to survive here. I expect honesty. I expect effort. Everything else will sort itself out." "But the marriage part requires trust," Caleb said, "and trust takes time. I'm not interested in forcing anything just because a preacher said some words over us. When we're ready, we'll know." It was perhaps the most respectful thing any man had ever said to her about that particular subject, and Mara felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "All right," she said. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar place, Mara listened to the wind howl around the cabin and wondered what the hell she'd gotten herself into. The next morning, Caleb woke her before dawn. "Get dressed," he said through the door. "You're learning to shoot today." They walked out to a clearing behind the cabin, where Caleb had set up makeshift targets against a hillside. He handed her a rifle that was heavier than she expected. "First rule," Caleb said, "never point it at anything you don't intend to kill. Second rule, assume it's always loaded. Third rule." The lesson went on for hours. Mara's shoulder ached from the recoil, her ears rang from the noise, and she missed more shots than she made. But by midday, she could hit the target 3 times out of 5, and Caleb seemed satisfied. "You'll practice every day," he said, "shooting, reloading, cleaning the rifle. It needs to become automatic." "Why? Are we expecting trouble?" "Always expecting trouble," Caleb said. "Bears, mountain lions, the occasional desperate man. Winter's the worst. Animals get hungry. People get desperate. You need to be able to defend yourself." The casual way he said it sent a chill down Mara's spine. This wasn't theoretical. This was her life now. The days fell into a brutal routine. Mornings were for shooting practice or trapline training. Caleb taught her to read animal signs, to set snares, to move quietly through the forest. Afternoons were for physical labor, cutting firewood, hauling water, repairing the cabin's chinking, preserving meat. Evenings were for maintenance, cleaning guns, mending clothes, organizing supplies. Mara's hands, already rough from years of work at the fort, developed new calluses. Her muscles, tested beyond anything she'd known, grew harder. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, but gained a kind of functional strength she'd never had before. And slowly, Grudgingly, she started to feel competent. 3 weeks after they'd arrived, Caleb took her on her first real trapline run. They left before dawn, packs loaded with supplies, and hiked into territory that made Mara's previous climbs look easy. The trail was barely visible, winding through dense forest and across streams that had to be forded carefully. "This is the northern line," Caleb explained as they walked. "I check it every 4 days during season. Southern line every 3. You need to learn both." "How far does it go?" "About 8 miles out, looping back. We'll hit 12 traps today. 12 traps across 8 miles of wilderness." Mara's legs already ached, and they'd barely started. The first trap was empty. The second held a marten, its neck broken cleanly. Caleb showed her how to remove it, reset the trap, and properly store the animal. The third trap had been sprung but was empty. Something had escaped or another predator had gotten there first. "Happens," Caleb said. "You don't win them all." By the 5th trap, Mara was exhausted. By the 8th, she was running on pure stubbornness. But she kept going, kept watching, kept learning. They were checking the 10th trap when Caleb suddenly froze. "Don't move," he said quietly. Mara's heart jumped into her throat. "What?" "Grizzly," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. "Upwind. About 40 yards. Mara's blood went cold. She couldn't see it, but she could hear it now, the heavy sound of something massive moving through the brush. "Back away slowly," Caleb instructed, his hand moving to his rifle. "Don't run. Don't make eye contact if you see it. Just move back the way we came." Mara's legs felt like water, but she moved. 1 step, 2. Behind her, Caleb matched her pace, his rifle ready. The bear broke through the tree line 30 yards away, a massive brown shape that looked more like a boulder than an animal. It stood on its hind legs, sniffing the air. "Keep moving," Caleb breathed. The bear dropped to all fours and turned its head toward them. For one horrible moment, Mara thought it would charge. But then it huffed, dismissed them as non-threatening or uninteresting, and lumbered off in the opposite direction. They didn't stop moving until they'd put a 1/4 mile between themselves and that clearing. When Caleb finally called a halt, Mara's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold her canteen. "That," Caleb said, "is why you always carry a rifle, and why you never, ever let your guard down out here." "Does that happen often?" Mara asked, her voice unsteady. "Often enough," Caleb said. "You handled it well, didn't panic." "I was terrified." "Being terrified and panicking are different things," Caleb said. "Terror's healthy, keeps you sharp. Panic gets you killed." They finished the trap line in tense silence, both of them hyper-aware of every sound in the forest. By the time they made it back to the cabin, Mara was so exhausted she could barely stand. But she'd done it. She'd run a full trap line, faced down a grizzly, and made it home alive. Caleb clapped her on the shoulder, brief but genuine. "Good work today." It shouldn't have meant as much as it did, but Mara felt a flush of pride anyway. That night, for the first time since they'd arrived, Caleb stayed for dinner instead of disappearing to work on something. They sat across from each other at the small table, eating elk stew, and the silence felt different, less awkward, almost comfortable. "Can I ask you something?" Mara said. "Go ahead." "Why do you live like this far from everyone?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering. "Tried living around people once, didn't take. Too many rules that didn't make sense, too many folks worried about what everyone else was doing. Out here things are simple. You work, you survive. You answer to nature instead of neighbors." "Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes," Caleb admitted. "But I'd rather be lonely and free than crowded and suffocated." "Is that why you never married before? Because you didn't want to give up the freedom?" "Partly," Caleb said. "Mostly because I never found anyone who understood what this life actually is. People romanticize it, think it's all beautiful sunsets and peaceful solitude. They don't think about the hunger, the cold, the way isolation can make you half crazy if you're not built for it." "What made you think I could handle it?" Caleb looked at her directly. "Because you've been surviving a different kind of hell for years and nobody noticed. If you can endure being invisible while working yourself to the bone for people who don't appreciate it, you can endure this." The observation hit harder than Mara expected. She'd never thought of her old life that way, but he was right. She'd been surviving, just in a different wilderness. "I hated them sometimes," Mara said quietly. My mother, Lydia. Is that terrible? No, Caleb said. It's honest. They treated you like you didn't matter. That kind of thing builds resentment. I feel guilty about it anyway. Guilt's useless, Caleb said. What matters is what you do with it. You could have stayed and let that resentment poison you, or you could leave and build something else. You chose to leave. That took courage. Or desperation. Sometimes they're the same thing, Caleb said. Either way, you're here now. That's what counts. They cleaned up together, falling into an easy rhythm. Mara washing, Caleb drying and putting away. It struck her how domestic it felt, how normal, despite the fact that nothing about their situation was normal at all. As they worked, Caleb spoke. We need to talk about winter. What about it? It's coming fast. Maybe 6 weeks before the first serious snow. We need to be completely ready because once it hits, we're locked in. No leaving, no second chances. If we're missing something critical, we'll just have to do without until spring. What do we still need? Caleb rattled off a list. More firewood than seemed possible. Additional food stores, repairs to the barn, weatherproofing for the cabin, medical supplies, ammunition. The list went on and the work seemed endless. Can we do all that in 6 weeks? Mara asked. We have to, Caleb said simply. It's not optional. So they worked. Every day became a race against the coming winter. Mara chopped wood until her hands bled, then wrapped them and kept chopping. She helped Caleb haul supplies, preserve meat, reinforce structures. Her body ached constantly, but she pushed through because the alternative was death. And somewhere in all that work, something shifted between them. It started small. Caleb began asking her opinion on things instead of just issuing instructions. Where should they stack this? Which trap line route made more sense? How should they organize the storage? Mara, in turn, stopped deferring to him automatically. She disagreed when she had a better idea. She pushed back when his plans didn't account for something. And instead of shutting her down, Caleb listened. The woodpile should be closer to the cabin, Mara said one afternoon. It's fine where it is, Caleb replied. It's 20 feet away. In a blizzard, that's a long walk for firewood. Caleb paused, considered, then nodded. You're right. Help me move it. It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental. He'd listened. He'd adjusted. He'd treated her input as valuable. They moved the woodpile. 4 weeks before winter, they had their first real fight. It started over something stupid. Mara had reorganized the storage shed to make things more accessible, and Caleb couldn't find his spare traps. Where did you put them? He demanded, frustration evident. On the left wall, sorted by size, Mara said. It makes more sense than having everything mixed together. It makes sense to you, Caleb said. I knew where everything was before you rearranged it. Where everything was before was chaos, Mara shot back. I spent 20 minutes yesterday looking for the whetstone because it was buried under furs. Then you should have asked me where it was instead of moving everything around without checking first. I shouldn't have to ask you for permission to organize a shared space, Mara said, her voice rising. I'm not a guest here, Caleb. I live here too. I know that. Do you? Because you still act like this is your cabin that I'm visiting, instead of our cabin that we're building together. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and true. Caleb's jaw worked. I've lived alone for 8 years. It's not easy to... I know it's not easy, Mara interrupted, but I can't tiptoe around your habits forever. Either I'm your partner or I'm not. You need to decide which. You are my partner, Caleb said, but he sounded uncertain, like he was still figuring out what that meant. Then act like it, Mara said. Stop making every decision unilaterally. Stop rearranging things I've organized without telling me. Stop treating me like I'm here to support your life instead of us building a life together. Caleb stared at her, and Mara braced for an explosion, but instead his shoulders dropped. You're right, he said quietly. I am doing that. I didn't realize, but you're right. The admission stunned her. She'd expected defensiveness, not concession. I've never been good at this, Caleb continued. Sharing space, sharing decisions. It doesn't come naturally. It doesn't come naturally to me either, Mara admitted. I spent my whole life being told what to do. I'm still learning how to have opinions that matter. They stood there in the shed, surrounded by neatly organized supplies, and the evidence of their conflict, and something fundamental shifted. "We're both learning," Caleb said finally. "So we'll make mistakes, but we talk about it. We adjust. Deal?" "Deal," Mara said. That night, Caleb moved his bedroll into the bedroom, not into Mara's bed. That was still a bridge neither was ready to cross, but into the same room, sharing space, literally and figuratively. The first few nights were awkward. They changed in silence, hyper-aware of each other in a way they hadn't been before. But gradually, it became normal. They talked before sleep, sharing observations about the day, planning for tomorrow. It wasn't romantic, but it was intimate in a different way. Partnership, Mara thought. This is what he meant by partnership. 3 weeks before winter, Caleb announced they were going on a supply run. "There's a trading post 2 days south," he explained. "Small operation, but they carry things we can't make ourselves. Salt, coffee, ammunition. We'll stock up before the snow flies." The trip was hard but familiar now. Mara's riding had improved enough that she didn't feel like she'd die in the saddle, and the trail didn't terrify her the way it had before. The trading post was a rough collection of buildings that made Fort Bridger look cosmopolitan. But it was civilization of a sort, and after weeks in isolation, Mara felt oddly overwhelmed by the dozen or so people milling around. While Caleb negotiated for supplies, Mara wandered, taking in faces and voices and the strange sensation of being around other humans. A woman approached her, older, weathered, with kind eyes. "You're new," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Mara admitted. "Caleb's wife?" Again, not really a question. "Yes." The woman nodded approvingly. "Good. He needed someone sensible. Too many girls think they want the mountain life because it sounds adventurous. You look like you know better." "I'm learning," Mara said carefully. "We all are, honey. I'm Ruth. My husband and I winter about 10 miles west of here. If you ever need anything, woman talk, medical help, just a face that isn't your husband's, you come find us. We look out for each other up here. Have to." It was the first time anyone had offered Mara community in this new life, and the unexpected kindness made her throat tight. "Thank you," she managed. They left the trading post loaded down with supplies and headed home. The cabin, when they reached it, felt different. It felt like arriving somewhere instead of just existing there. "Home," Mara said, testing the word. Caleb smiled, rare and genuine. "Yeah, home." The last 2 weeks before winter were frantic. They worked dawn to dark, preparing for months of isolation. And on the final night before the first snow was predicted, they stood outside the cabin looking at everything they'd accomplished. The woodpile was massive, the larder was full, the cabin was sealed tight. They'd done it. "Think we're ready?" Mara asked. "As ready as we'll get," Caleb said. "The rest is just surviving it." That night, the first snow fell. And the next morning, when Mara woke to a world transformed into white, she didn't feel trapped. She felt something else entirely. She felt ready. The snow didn't stop for 3 days. It came down in thick, heavy curtains that transformed the world into something unrecognizable. The trails disappeared. The landmarks vanished. Even the stable was barely visible from the cabin door, just a dark shape in an endless sea of white. Mara stood at the window on the third morning, watching the relentless fall, and felt the first stirrings of real fear. "How long does this usually last?" she asked. Caleb was at the table, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. "The first storm? Could be a few more days, could be a week. Winter doesn't follow a schedule. And we just wait?" "We wait," Caleb confirmed. "Check the animals twice a day, keep the fire going, stay inside otherwise. Fighting the weather is a waste of energy." The cabin, which had felt cozy during preparation, now felt small, cramped. By the 4th day of confinement, Mara was climbing the walls. She'd reorganized their supplies twice, mended every piece of clothing that needed it, and cooked enough to feed an army. There was nothing left to do except exist in this tiny space with a man she was still learning to live with. Caleb, by contrast, seemed perfectly content. He read the same 3 books they owned, worked on equipment maintenance, and occasionally stared into the fire like he was watching something fascinating. The silence didn't bother him at all. It was driving Mara insane. "Don't you get bored?" she finally asked on day 5. Caleb looked up from the beaver pelt he was scraping. Not really. How? I'm used to it, he said with a shrug. Winters here are long. You learn to be comfortable with quiet. I'm not, Mara admitted. I'm used to noise, people, movement. You'll adjust, Caleb said, the same thing he'd told her about everything else. Takes time. But time was exactly what they had too much of now. Hours stretched into days, days blurred together, and Mara felt herself starting to fray at the edges. She wasn't made for this kind of stillness. She'd spent her whole life in motion, working, serving, doing. Sitting idle felt wrong. On the 6th day, she snapped. Can you stop that? She said sharply. Caleb paused, the whetstone frozen against his knife blade. Stop what? That noise. The scraping. It's been constant for an hour. I'm sharpening knives, Caleb said slowly. We use them. They get dull. I sharpen them. That's how this works. I know how it works, Mara said, hearing the edge in her own voice but unable to control it. I just need you to stop for 5 minutes. Caleb set down the knife and stone with deliberate care. What's actually bothering you? Nothing's bothering me. You're picking a fight over knife sharpening, Caleb said. Something's bothering you. Mara stood abruptly, needing movement, needing space that didn't exist. I can't breathe in here. It's too small, it's too quiet, and I feel like the walls are closing in. So you're taking it out on me. I'm not... Mara stopped, forced herself to breathe. Maybe I am. I don't know. I'm not good at this. At what? Being still, Mara said. Having nothing to do, nowhere to go, just existing in one place with one person and nothing but time. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, walked to the door, and started pulling on his coat. Where are you going? Mara asked. Out, Caleb said. You need space, so do I. I'll check the animals, walk the perimeter, give you time alone. He was gone before she could respond, the door closing firmly behind him. Mara stood in the suddenly empty cabin and felt like the worst kind of fool. He'd been nothing but patient with her, and she'd repaid him by snapping over something as mundane as knife sharpening. She pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself not to cry, because crying was useless, and she had no right to it anyway. When Caleb came back an hour later, snow-covered and half-frozen, Mara had coffee waiting. I'm sorry, she said as he shed his coat. You didn't deserve that. Caleb accepted the coffee, wrapping his cold hands around the cup. No, I didn't, but I understand it. You do? First winter's the hardest, Caleb said. The isolation gets to everyone. I should have warned you better about what it would feel like. You told me it would be brutal. I told you about the work and the danger, Caleb said. I didn't tell you about the way time moves differently up here, how the silence can get so loud it feels like screaming, how you start to forget what other voices sound like. Mara sat across from him, cradling her own cup. How did you survive it the first time? Barely, Caleb admitted. I was younger, stupider, and I had this idea that solitude would be peaceful. Instead, I damn near went crazy. Talked to myself, had conversations with the walls, started seeing things that weren't there. What changed? I learned to work with it instead of against it, Caleb said. Started keeping a routine even when there was nothing that needed doing. Read the same books over and over until I could recite them. Carved things from wood just to keep my hands busy. You need projects, things that give structure when there isn't any. Like what? Caleb thought for a moment. You want to learn to tan hides? It's tedious work, takes days, but it keeps you occupied. And so Mara learned to tan hides. Caleb taught her the process, scraping, treating, stretching, drying. It was indeed tedious, demanding constant attention and effort, but it gave her something to focus on beyond the 4 walls and the endless snow. The work helped, but it didn't solve the underlying problem. They were 2 people who'd barely known each other, suddenly trapped in close quarters, with nowhere to escape. Every habit became magnified. Every quirk became irritating. Caleb, Mara discovered, was meticulous to the point of obsession about certain things. His tools had to be arranged in exactly the right order. His morning routine couldn't be disrupted. He needed the first hour after waking to be silent, no conversation, just coffee and contemplation. Mara, Caleb discovered, couldn't sit still for more than an hour without finding something to clean or organize or fix. She talked through problems out loud, a habit that drove him to distraction. And she had a tendency to move his carefully arranged items when she was cleaning, which violated his need for order. The small annoyances built up like snowdrifts. 2 weeks into the storm, because that's what it had become, one continuous assault of snow and wind, they had their second real fight. Mara had been organizing the storage area again, trying to make better use of the limited space. She'd moved Caleb's hunting equipment to a different wall, consolidating it with other outdoor gear. When Caleb went to grab his snowshoes and couldn't find them in their usual spot, he lost his composure. "Where are they?" he demanded. "Where are what?" "My snowshoes. They're supposed to be by the door." "I moved them to the storage room with the other winter equipment," Mara said, not looking up from the hide she was scraping. "Makes more sense to have it all together." "It makes sense to have them where I can grab them quickly when I need them," Caleb said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "They're 10 feet away. That's not the point," Caleb interrupted. "The point is you moved something without asking me first. Again." Mara set down her scraping tool and turned to face him. "I live here too, Caleb. I'm allowed to organize our space." "Our space," Caleb repeated. "That's what you keep saying. But you only seem to remember it's our space when you want to change something. When I want things a certain way, suddenly I'm being controlling." "You are being controlling," Mara shot back. "Everything has to be exactly how you want it. Your system, your arrangement, your way of doing things. When do I get a say? You get a say when you bother to ask instead of just rearranging everything while I'm not looking. I shouldn't have to ask permission to put things where they make sense. And I shouldn't have to hunt through the cabin for my own equipment because you decided to play house." The words hit like a slap. Mara felt her face flush hot with anger and hurt. "Play house?" she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" Caleb had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I didn't mean—" "No, you meant it," Mara said, standing. "You think I'm just playing at this, that I'm not really building a life here, I'm just rearranging furniture to pass the time." "That's not what I said." "It's what you meant," Mara said. "You still see this as your cabin, your life, and I'm just the woman you brought along to help with chores." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Mara challenged. "You say we're partners, but you won't let me change anything. You say this is our home, but you treat every decision like it needs your approval. You want a wife who'll do what you tell her and stay out of your way." "I want a wife who communicates," Caleb said, his own anger rising now. "Who talks about changes instead of just making them. Who considers that maybe, just maybe, I have reasons for doing things the way I do them." "And I want a husband who trusts me enough to make decisions without supervision," Mara countered. "Who treats me like an equal instead of an employee." They stood there, facing each other across the small cabin, both breathing hard, both too angry to back down. "You want to know why I keep my snowshoes by the door?" Caleb said finally, his voice rough. "Because 2 years ago I got caught in a whiteout. Couldn't see 2 feet in front of my face. Took me 6 hours to make it back to the cabin, and by then I had frostbite so bad I nearly lost 3 toes. If I'd had to waste time searching for my snowshoes, I'd be dead. Everything I do has a reason, Mara. It's not about control. It's about survival." The explanation deflated some of Mara's anger, but not all of it. "Then tell me that. Explain your reasons instead of just getting mad when I move things. I'm not a mind reader, Caleb. I don't know your history or your traumas or why you do things unless you talk to me." "I'm not good at talking," Caleb admitted. "Neither am I," Mara said. "But we're going to have to get better at it or we'll kill each other before spring." The truth of that hung between them, undeniable and stark. Caleb sat heavily at the table, running his hands through his hair. "I don't know how to do this. Share everything. Compromise. I've been on my own too long." "And I've been invisible too long," Mara said, sitting across from him. "So when I finally have the power to make changes, I go overboard. We're both broken in different ways." "Broken," Caleb repeated. "That's a word for it." "So we fix it," Mara said. "We talk more. We explain our reasons. We find compromises that don't make either of us feel like we're losing." "How?" "I don't know," Mara admitted. "But we figure it out together. That's what partners do, right?" Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Your snowshoes go by the door, mine too. Everything else we can negotiate. Fair enough, Mara said, and I'll ask before reorganizing major things. But the small stuff, if I move a coffee tin or reorganize the linens, you let it go. Deal, Caleb said. They shook on it, formal and slightly ridiculous, and despite everything, Mara felt a smile tugging at her lips. We're a mess, she said. Yeah, Caleb agreed. But we're figuring it out. The fight had cleared the air somehow. They moved around each other more carefully after that, more conscious of communication. Caleb explained his systems, and Mara learned the reasons behind them. Mara voiced her needs, and Caleb learned to accommodate them. It wasn't perfect. They still irritated each other, but they were learning to navigate it. The snow finally stopped after 3 weeks, and the silence it left behind was almost eerie. Caleb ventured out first, breaking trail to the stable, and came back with news. 4 feet of accumulation, he said, maybe more in the drifts. We're locked in for a while. How long is a while? Depends on the temperature, could be days, could be weeks. But at least the snow had stopped, and that felt like a victory. Caleb spent the next week digging out, creating paths to the stable, the storage shed, the woodpile. Mara helped when she could, though the snow was so deep she sometimes disappeared into it entirely. They worked in shifts, trading off between outdoor labor and indoor warmth, and slowly reclaimed their small corner of the mountain. 3 days after Caleb declared them sufficiently dug out, he announced they were checking the trap lines. Now? Mara asked, looking at the still deep snow. Animals are moving again, Caleb said. That means the traps are working. We need to check them before scavengers get everything. The trip was brutal. The snowshoes helped, but hiking through powder that deep was like wading through quicksand. Mara's legs burned after the first half-mile, screamed after the first mile, and by the time they reached the second trap, she was running on pure stubbornness. But she kept up. She checked the traps she'd been taught to check, reset them when necessary, and carried her share of the haul. Caleb watched her with something that might have been approval, but he didn't slow down or offer help unless she asked for it. They were 3 miles in when it happened. The trap had caught a beaver, a big one, valuable. Caleb knelt to remove it, and Mara was resetting the mechanism when she heard him curse. What's wrong? Lodgepole snag, Caleb said through gritted teeth. My coat's caught. Mara moved around to see the problem. Caleb's heavy coat had snagged on a dead tree branch that had fallen across the trap site, and in trying to free himself, he'd only made it worse. The branch was at an awkward angle, wedged between rocks and frozen ground. Hold still, Mara said. Let me. Caleb shifted his weight to give her better access, and that's when everything went wrong. The rocks beneath the branch weren't as stable as they looked. When Caleb's weight shifted, they gave way. The branch whipped free with sudden violence, and Caleb, thrown off balance, went down hard. Mara heard the crack. It was a sound she'd never forget, something brittle breaking under too much pressure. Caleb! He was on his side in the snow, his face white with shock, his left arm bent at an angle that made Mara's stomach lurch. Don't move, she said, dropping to her knees beside him. Don't. Just stay still. My arm, Caleb said, his voice tight with pain. Think it's broken. Mara's hands shook as she carefully pulled back his coat. The break was obvious. His forearm had a sickening deviation that shouldn't exist. Not a compound fracture, thank everything, but definitely broken. We need to splint it, Mara said, trying to remember everything she'd learned about field medicine, and get you back to the cabin. 3 miles, Caleb said through clenched teeth, in this snow. Can you walk? Have to. Mara used fallen branches to create a makeshift splint, binding it tight with strips torn from her own undershirt. Caleb's face was gray with pain, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. This is going to hurt, she warned. It already hurts. She helped him to his feet, and Caleb swayed dangerously. Mara grabbed him, taking as much of his weight as she could manage. Slow, she said. We go slow and steady. No rushing. The trip back was a nightmare. Caleb was bigger than her by at least 70 pounds of solid muscle, and even with him trying to carry his own weight, Mara was supporting more than she could comfortably manage. The snow made every step treacherous. Caleb stumbled twice, each time nearly taking them both down. By the time the cabin came into view, Mara's shoulders were screaming and her legs were jelly. But they'd made it. She got Caleb inside, got him settled by the fire, got his coat off as carefully as she could manage. The splint had held, but his arm was already swelling badly. "I need to set it properly," Mara said, panic clawing at her throat. "But I don't know how—" "There's a book," Caleb said, his words slightly slurred. "Medical guide, top shelf." Mara found it, hands shaking as she flipped through pages. The illustrations were crude but clear. She read the section on fractures 3 times, committing it to memory. "This is going to hurt," she said again. "I know." She gave him whiskey first, a lot of it. Then she removed the field splint and examined the break more carefully. It looked like a clean fracture, both bones, mid-shaft. The book said to align the bones, splint firmly, and watch for complications. Simple. Except she'd never done this before, and the man she was about to hurt was her husband. "Do it," Caleb said, reading her hesitation. "Fast is better than gentle." Mara took a breath, positioned her hands the way the book showed, and pulled. Caleb's roar of pain echoed through the cabin. Mara felt the bones shift, grind, align. She held the position, wrapped the new splint tight, and secured it with leather straps. When it was done, Caleb was panting, his face slick with sweat, but the arm was straight again. "Good," he managed. "That's good." Mara sank back on her heels, shaking. "I think I'm going to be sick." "Outside," Caleb said. "Don't want to clean it up." She barely made it out the door before vomiting into the snow. When she came back in, Caleb had passed out. Whether from the whiskey, the pain, or sheer exhaustion, she couldn't tell. Mara covered him with blankets, built up the fire, and then sat watching him sleep, the full weight of their situation crashing down on her. Caleb was incapacitated. His dominant arm was broken, useless for at least 6 weeks. They were snowed in 3 days' hard ride from the nearest help, and winter had barely started. Everything, all the work, all the survival, all the decisions, now fell on her. Mara was terrified, but she got up the next morning anyway. The first few days were chaos. Caleb ran a fever from the trauma, drifting in and out of consciousness. Mara kept him hydrated, changed the dressing on his arm, watched for signs of infection. She also had to do everything else: feed the animals, haul water, keep the fire going, cook meals, maintain the cabin. She worked 18-hour days and fell into bed so exhausted she couldn't think, but she kept them alive. On the 4th day, Caleb's fever broke. He woke clear-headed for the first time, took in Mara's haggard appearance, and swore. "How bad is it?" he asked. "What? How far behind are we?" Mara did a mental inventory. "The animals are fed, water's hauled, fire's maintained. We're not behind, we're managing." "You're managing," Caleb corrected. "By yourself." "You're hurt. What else was I supposed to do? I'm supposed to be pulling my weight." "You will," Mara said, "when you can. Right now, you rest and heal." But Caleb couldn't rest. He was too used to constant motion, constant work. He tried to help one-handed and mostly just got in the way. He snapped at her when she wouldn't let him do things he clearly couldn't manage. He was a terrible patient. "I'm going insane," he admitted one night. "I noticed," Mara said dryly. "I hate being useless." "You're not useless. You're injured. There's a difference." "Doesn't feel like it." Mara sat beside him, bone-tired but needing him to understand. "You taught me everything I know about surviving here. Every skill I'm using right now, you gave me. So no, you're not useless. You're the reason I can do this at all." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You're stronger than I thought." "I'm stronger than I thought too," Mara admitted. Winter deepened. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, the cold more vicious. Caleb's arm healed slowly, too slowly. He grew more mobile but remained limited, and the frustration ate at him. Then, 6 weeks after the break, the blizzard hit. It came with no warning, a wall of white that descended like a living thing. The wind howled so loud it drowned out thought. The cold was vicious, dropping to temperatures that made exposed skin freeze in seconds. They huddled in the cabin as the storm raged for 3 days straight. The world outside disappeared. Even the stable was invisible. On the second day, Mara knew something was wrong. She felt it first as pressure in her lower back, a dull ache that she ignored because everything ached in this cold. But then came the cramping, rhythmic and insistent, and a wet warmth between her legs that turned her blood to ice. She stumbled to the bedroom, closed the door, and discovered she was bleeding. Mara hadn't known she was pregnant. They'd been intimate only a handful of times, awkward couplings in the dark that neither of them talked about. She'd missed her monthly courses, but she'd attributed it to stress and physical labor. Now she understood. And now she was losing it. The pain intensified, waves of cramping that drove her to her knees. She bit down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming, not wanting Caleb to know, not wanting to burden him when he was still healing. But the body doesn't care about pride. Hours later, when it was over, Mara sat on the floor surrounded by bloodied rags and understood that she'd lost something she'd never known she had. The grief was irrational, but overwhelming. She cleaned herself up mechanically, burned the evidence in the fire while Caleb slept, and said nothing. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a silence so complete it hurt. Mara went through the motions, checking the animals, hauling water, cooking meals. She said nothing about the pain still cramping her abdomen or the hollowness in her chest, but Caleb noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked on the fifth day. "Nothing." "You're lying." "I'm fine." "Mara, I said I'm fine." The sharpness in her voice surprised them both. Caleb backed off, but he kept watching, and that night, when she thought he was asleep, the grief finally broke through. She cried as quietly as she could, face buried in her pillow, but in a cabin this small, there was no real privacy. Caleb's good hand touched her shoulder. "Tell me." And finally she did. The words came haltingly, broken by sobs, but she told him everything. The pregnancy she hadn't known about, the miscarriage during the storm, the loss of something that had barely begun to exist but felt monumental anyway. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he pulled her against his chest with his good arm and held her while she shook apart. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry." "Why?" Mara asked through tears. "It's not your fault." "Feels like it should be somebody's fault," Caleb said. "Feels like this place, this life. Maybe it's too hard. Maybe I was selfish bringing you here." "Stop," Mara said, pulling back to look at him. "Don't do that. Don't make this about your guilt. I chose this. I knew it would be hard. I just didn't know it would be this hard." They sat together in the darkness, both of them broken in different ways, both of them trying to figure out how to keep going. "We survived this," Caleb said finally. "Together. That's all we can do." And slowly, painfully, they did. Caleb's arm continued to heal. Mara's body recovered. They worked together as he regained strength, falling back into their routines. They didn't talk about the miscarriage again. It sat between them like a ghost, but it changed something fundamental. They were gentler with each other, more conscious of vulnerability, more willing to admit when they were struggling. Winter finally began to loosen its grip. The days lengthened. The temperatures climbed above freezing more often. And one morning, Mara woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves. Spring was coming. She stood at the window, watching the world begin to thaw, and felt Caleb's presence behind her. "We made it," he said. "We did," Mara agreed. They'd survived the isolation, the injuries, the losses. They'd survived each other and themselves. And in the process, they'd become something neither of them had quite expected. They'd become a team. Spring arrived in fits and starts, never quite committing. One day would bring sunshine and melting snow. The next would slam them with another storm. But the trajectory was clear. Winter was losing its grip, and the mountain was waking up. Caleb's arm had healed enough that he could use it again, though he favored it still and couldn't lift heavy loads. They worked together clearing the winter's damage, repairing a section of fence. The snow had collapsed, patching the stable roof where ice had torn through, restocking supplies they'd depleted. Mara noticed the change in how they moved around each other. Before the winter, they'd been tentative, uncertain of their boundaries. Now they anticipated each other's movements, worked in synchronization without needing to speak. When Caleb reached for a tool, Mara already had it ready. When Mara struggled with something heavy, Caleb was there to help before she asked. They'd become fluent in each other, and it had happened so gradually neither could pinpoint when. One morning in early April, Mara woke feeling different. Not sick exactly, but off. Her breasts were tender, her sense of smell heightened, and when Caleb made coffee, the aroma made her stomach turn. She said nothing, refusing to hope, refusing to even consider the possibility. But her body knew. 2 weeks later, when her courses failed to arrive again, she allowed herself to wonder. Another week, and the morning nausea confirmed it. She was pregnant. The fear hit first, memories of blood and pain and loss flooding back. She couldn't go through that again. She wouldn't survive it. But beneath the fear was something else, something fragile and hopeful that she didn't dare name yet. She waited another week before telling Caleb, needing to be certain, needing to believe it might actually last this time. They were working on the garden plot, turning soil, preparing for planting, when she finally spoke. "I'm pregnant," she said, the words falling into the space between them like stones into still water. Caleb's hands stilled on the shovel. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You're sure?" "Pretty sure," Mara said. "All the signs are there." He set down the shovel carefully, deliberately. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified," Mara admitted. "After last time." "I know," Caleb said quietly. He crossed to her, took her hands in his. "We'll be careful this time. No heavy lifting, no long treks, nothing that puts you at risk." "We can't afford for me to stop working," Mara protested. "There's too much to do." "Then I'll do more," Caleb said firmly. "My arm's better. I can handle it." "Caleb, no," he interrupted, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "We lost one already. I won't risk losing another because we were too stubborn to adjust." The conviction in his voice steadied something inside her. She nodded, squeezing his hands. "All right," she said. "We'll be careful." True to his word, Caleb took on the heavier tasks. He wouldn't let her haul water anymore, insisted she rest more, monitored her constantly. It should have felt suffocating, but instead it felt like being protected for the first time in her life. The pregnancy progressed. Mara's body changed, her belly rounding, her energy fluctuating wildly. Some days she felt invincible. Others, she could barely get out of bed. Caleb adapted to all of it, patient in a way she'd never expected from him. They were preparing for a supply run to the trading post when Mara suggested something that had been on her mind for weeks. "I want to see my father," she said. Caleb looked up from the pack he was organizing. "Your father?" "He helped me when I left," Mara said. "Gave me his coat, stood by me when Mother and Lydia wouldn't. I want him to know I'm all right, that we're all right." "It's a long trip," Caleb said carefully. 5 days there, 5 back, plus however long we stay. And you're pregnant." "I'm pregnant, not dying," Mara said. "I can handle a trip on horseback." "That's not what I'm worried about," Caleb admitted. "What if your mother's there? Your sister? After how they treated you?" "They can't hurt me anymore," Mara said, with more confidence than she felt. "I'm not the same person who left. I'm stronger now." Caleb studied her for a long moment. "You are," he agreed finally. "All right, we go. But we take it slow, and if you're tired, we stop." The journey to Fort Bridger took 7 days instead of 5. They went at Mara's pace, stopping frequently, camping early. It should have been frustrating, but Caleb never complained. He just adjusted. On the 6th night, camped beside a creek, Mara woke to find Caleb sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "Can't sleep?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Thinking. About what?" "About how different this is," Caleb said. "Having someone to care about, worrying about someone other than myself. I didn't expect that." "You didn't expect to care?" Mara sat up, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "I expected partnership," Caleb said. "Respect, maybe. But this," he gestured vaguely, "this is something else." "What is it?" Mara asked softly. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Love. I think. I'm not good at it, but I think that's what this is." The words settled over Mara like a physical weight. Not burdensome, but grounding, real. "I love you too," she said, and realized it was true. Not the romantic, swept-away kind of love from stories. Something deeper. Something built from shared struggle and mutual respect, and the choice to keep choosing each other even when it was hard. Caleb looked at her, something vulnerable in his expression. I never thought I'd have this. A family, someone who stays. I'm staying, Mara said firmly. Whatever comes, I'm staying. He crossed to her then, pulled her into his arms, and held her like she was something precious. They stayed like that, wrapped together under the stars, until the fire burned low and sleep finally claimed them both. They reached Fort Bridger on the 7th day. The trading post looked exactly the same. Weathered buildings, busy with the spring traffic, the familiar smells of commerce and survival. But Mara felt like a different person riding through those gates. Thomas saw them first. He was outside the store, unloading supplies, and he stopped mid-motion when he spotted Mara. Papa, Mara called, dismounting carefully. Thomas dropped what he was holding and crossed to her in 3 long strides. He pulled her into a fierce hug, the kind he'd never given her before she left. You're alive, he said, his voice rough. I worried. Your mother said you'd be dead within months. I'm not dead, Mara said, pulling back to smile at him. I'm thriving. Thomas took in her appearance, the lean strength of her body, the confidence in her bearing, the unmistakable swell of her belly. And his eyes widened. You're expecting, he said. I am, Mara confirmed. She reached back for Caleb, who'd been hanging back. Papa, you remember Caleb? Mr. Hale, Caleb said, extending his hand. Thomas shook it, his grip firm. Call me Thomas. You're family now. He looked between them, something like pride in his expression. Come inside. Let me get you settled. Catherine was in the back room when they entered. She froze when she saw Mara, her face cycling through shock, anger, and something that might have been shame. Mara, she said stiffly. Mother, Mara replied with equal formality. The silence stretched awkward and tense until Thomas cleared his throat. Mara and Caleb are staying for a few days. They've come a long way. I can see that, Catherine said, her eyes dropping to Mara's belly with an expression Mara couldn't quite read. Lydia appeared from the other room, and the shock on her face was almost comical. She'd changed too, looked older somehow, less certain. The easy confidence that had always clung to her had faded. Mara? Lydia said. You're here. I am, Mara said. They stood there, the 3 Hale women, and the weight of everything unsaid hung between them like a curtain. Finally, Catherine spoke. You look well. It wasn't an apology, but coming from Catherine, it was close. I am well, Mara said. Better than I've ever been, actually. The pregnancy agrees with you, Catherine said, and there was something almost wistful in her voice. It does, Mara agreed. She looked at her mother directly. I'm happy, Mother. Caleb is a good man, and we've built a good life together. Catherine's jaw tightened, but she nodded. I'm glad. It was the closest thing to a blessing Mara would get, and she accepted it. Over the next few days, Mara and Caleb stayed at the fort. They helped Thomas with the store, traded their furs, restocked supplies. And slowly, carefully, Mara rebuilt some bridges with her family. She and Lydia took a walk on the 2nd day. They didn't talk about the past at first, just walked, relearning how to be in each other's presence. Are you really happy? Lydia asked finally. I am, Mara said. It's hard work, and the isolation is brutal sometimes, but it's mine. I matter there. I'm engaged, Lydia said abruptly, to a merchant's son from back east. He's kind, boring, and completely safe. Do you love him? I don't know, Lydia admitted. I'm not sure I know what love is supposed to feel like. But Mother approves, and he'll take care of me, so I suppose that's enough. Mara heard the resignation in her sister's voice and felt a pang of sympathy. You deserve more than enough, Lydia. You deserve to choose. Like you did? Lydia's smile was sad. You were always braver than me, Mara. I just hid it better. They walked in silence after that, but it felt companionable rather than tense. When they returned to the post, Lydia squeezed Mara's hand briefly, a gesture of something like reconciliation. Catherine remained distant but less hostile.
On their last night, she pulled Mara aside. "I was wrong," Catherine said stiffly. "About you. About him. About what you could handle. I thought you'd fail, and I hoped you would because it would prove I was right. That makes me a terrible mother." Mara didn't disagree, but she didn't need to anymore. "I forgive you," she said. "Not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to carry it anymore." Catherine nodded, blinking rapidly. "Your father told me what you survived this winter. The injury, the loss. Most women wouldn't have made it through."
Most women are stronger than you give them credit for, Mara said quietly. I'm beginning to see that, Catherine admitted. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. And for Mara, that was enough. They left Fort Bridger on the fourth day, loaded with supplies and lighter in spirit. The trip back was easier than the trip there. Mara felt settled in a way she hadn't before, like some old wound had finally scabbed over. When they crested the final ridge and saw their cabin nestled in the valley below, Mara felt her chest swell with something that could only be called homecoming. There it is, Caleb said, and the satisfaction in his voice matched what she felt. Home, Mara agreed. They settled back into their routines, but with a new awareness of what they were building. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was a life. A family. The pregnancy progressed through summer. Mara's belly grew round and heavy, and by August she could barely see her own feet. Caleb treated her like she was made of glass, which both touched and irritated her. I can still work, she protested when he tried to take over cooking one evening. I know you can, Caleb said, but you don't have to do everything. If I don't stay busy, I'll go crazy, Mara said. I need to feel useful. You're growing a human, Caleb pointed out. That's pretty useful. Despite her protests, Mara did slow down. Her body demanded it. She tired more easily, her back ached constantly, and by September she spent most of her time preparing the things they'd need when the baby came. She sewed tiny clothes from soft leather and traded fabric. She prepared a cradle that Caleb carved from pine. She stockpiled supplies and made lists and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. Caleb built a shelf specifically for baby supplies, organized with the same meticulous care he applied to his trapping equipment. The sight of this hard, practical man fussing over infant clothing made Mara's heart ache in the best way. What if I don't know what to do? She asked one night, her hands resting on her enormous belly. Then we figure it out, Caleb said. Same way we've figured out everything else. A baby's different than a trap line. Is it though? Caleb's eyes glinted with humor. Both require constant attention. Both can be dangerous if you're not careful, and both will keep you up at night. Mara laughed despite her anxiety. That's terrible. But not wrong, Caleb said. He placed his hand over hers on her belly, feeling the baby move beneath their palms. We'll manage. We always do. The first snow came early that year in mid-October. Mara was huge by then, uncomfortable and ready to be done. She waddled more than walked, and getting up from a chair required planning. I'm enormous, she complained. You're pregnant, Caleb corrected. Same thing. Not even close. They were prepared this time for winter's isolation. The woodpile was massive, the larder full, the cabin tight and warm. But they hadn't prepared for the baby to come early. Mara woke in the middle of the night to wetness spreading beneath her and a cramping sensation that felt ominously familiar. Caleb, she said, her voice tight. He was awake instantly. What's wrong? My water broke. For a man who'd faced down grizzlies without flinching, Caleb looked terrified. It's too early. You're not due for another 3 weeks. Tell that to the baby, Mara said through clenched teeth as a contraction hit. The labor was long and brutal. Contractions came in waves, each one harder than the last. Caleb stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her face, talking her through breathing like he had any idea what he was doing. You're doing great, he said after the 10th hour. Don't lie to me, Mara gasped. I'm dying. You're not dying. How would you know? Because you're too stubborn to die, Caleb said firmly. Now breathe. Hour 15, and Mara was convinced she wouldn't survive this. The pain was beyond anything she'd imagined, beyond what she thought she could endure. She gripped Caleb's hand hard enough to bruise and screamed when her body demanded it. I can't, she sobbed. I can't do this anymore.
You can, Caleb said, his voice steady even though his face was pale. You're the strongest person I know, Mara. You can do this. Hour 18, the urge to push became overwhelming. Caleb, armed only with the medical guide and sheer determination, talked her through it. That's it, he said. Just like that. You're doing it. The baby crowned, and Mara screamed. One more push, then another, and suddenly there was a sound that hadn't existed before. A thin, angry wail. It's a girl, Caleb said, his voice breaking. Mara, it's a girl.
He placed the baby on Mara's chest, and she looked down at this tiny, furious creature covered in blood and vernix, and absolutely perfect. Hello, Mara whispered, tears streaming down her face. Hello, little one. The baby had dark hair like Caleb and Mara's determined chin. Her eyes were squinted shut, her fists waving with newborn fury, and she was the most beautiful thing Mara had ever seen. Caleb cut the cord with shaking hands, then collapsed beside Mara, staring at their daughter with wonder. We did it, he said. We did, Mara agreed, exhausted and exhilarated and more terrified than she'd ever been, because now there was someone else to keep alive, someone who depended on them completely. What do we name her? Caleb asked. Mara thought about it, looking at this small person who'd fought her way into the world 3 weeks early in the middle of a mountain winter. Winter, she said. We'll call her Winter. Because she's as fierce as the season and twice as stubborn, Caleb smiled, pressing a kiss to Mara's forehead. Winter Draven. I like it. The first weeks were chaos. Winter needed constant attention, feeding every few hours, changing constantly, crying for reasons Mara couldn't always decipher. She was exhausted beyond measure, her body aching from birth, her mind foggy from lack of sleep. But Caleb was there. He took the baby when Mara needed to rest, learned to change diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Winter against his chest when she wouldn't settle. He was awkward at first, his large hands uncertain with something so small, but he learned. They both did. One night, 3 weeks after Winter's birth, Mara woke to find Caleb sitting by the fire with their daughter asleep on his chest. He was humming something tuneless, his hand spanning almost her entire back, and the look on his face was one of pure contentment. Mara's heart squeezed painfully. This hard man, this survivor who'd lived alone for so long, had transformed into a father without her even noticing when. You're good at this, she said softly. Caleb looked up, smiled. She's easy to love. She screamed for 2 hours yesterday. Still easy, Caleb said. She's ours. That simple, possessive, ours, held a world of meaning. Winter grew. By December she was smiling, by January she was cooing, and by February she was the undisputed center of their universe. The cabin that had once felt too small now felt exactly right, filled with the sounds of a baby discovering the world. The second winter was easier than the first in every way that mattered. Yes, they were still isolated. Yes, the work was still brutal. Yes, the cold was just as vicious. But they faced it as a unit now. Mara, Caleb, and Winter. They'd survived the worst and built something beautiful from it. On a clear day in March, Mara stood outside with Winter bundled against her chest, watching Caleb repair a section of fence. The mountain spread before them, vast and white and unforgiving, but it was theirs. They'd earned their place here through blood and sweat and determination. What are you thinking about? Caleb asked, catching her expression. About how far we've come, Mara said. About how different everything is. Better different or worse different? Better, Mara said without hesitation. So much better. Caleb crossed to her, wrapped his arms around both of them. I never thought I'd have this. A family. A home that felt like more than just shelter. Neither did I, Mara admitted. I thought I'd spend my life invisible. You're the most visible person in my world, Caleb said. You and her. He touched Winter's head gently. You're everything. Mara leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the weight of their daughter between them, and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. They'd started as strangers bound by a practical arrangement. They'd become partners through necessity. But somewhere along the way, Through the hard winters and harder losses and the daily choice to keep choosing each other, they'd become something more. They'd become a family. And standing there on that mountain, surrounded by the wilderness that had tested them in every possible way, Mara finally understood what Caleb had meant that first night at Fort Bridger. He hadn't been looking for beauty. He'd been looking for strength, and in finding her, he'd helped her find herself. Spring turned to summer, and winter grew from an infant into a curious baby who seemed determined to explore everything within reach. At 6 months, she was already trying to crawl, her small fists grabbing at anything she could touch. Mara spent half her time keeping the baby out of danger, and the other half marveling at how fast everything was changing. The cabin felt different now with a child in it. There were always diapers drying by the fire, small clothes scattered on chairs, and the constant sounds of babbling and laughter that filled spaces silence used to occupy. It was chaos, but it was theirs. One morning in early June, Mara was working in the garden while Winter napped in a basket under the shade of a pine tree. She heard hoofbeats and looked up to see riders approaching, 3 of them, moving slowly up the trail. Her hand went automatically to the rifle leaning against the fence post. Caleb was checking the northern trap line and wouldn't be back until evening. She was alone with the baby. The riders came closer, and Mara's grip on the rifle relaxed slightly when she recognized the lead horse. It was Ruth, the woman from the trading post who'd offered friendship that first winter. Behind her rode 2 men Mara didn't know. "Hello, the cabin," Ruth called out, the traditional greeting that meant no threat. "Hello yourself," Mara called back, lowering the rifle but keeping it close. "What brings you up here?" Ruth dismounted, wincing slightly. She was older than Mara had remembered, probably pushing 60, with gray hair pulled back severe and eyes that missed nothing. "Had to come see if the rumors were true," Ruth said, approaching the fence. "Word at the post is that you and Caleb made it through your first winter and had a baby to boot. Wanted to see for myself." "We did," Mara confirmed. "Both of us still alive and mostly functional." Ruth laughed, a rough bark of sound. "That's more than most manage their first year up here." "Where's that man of yours?" "Trap line. He'll be back tonight." "Good. These 2," Ruth gestured to the men, "are my boys, Jacob and Sam. They're building a cabin about 15 miles west, and I told them they should meet the neighbors, such as neighbors are out here." The men dismounted, both younger versions of their mother, weathered, practical, with the kind of lean strength that came from hard living. They nodded to Mara with the respect that felt genuine. "Ma told us about you," Jacob said. "Said you were the real deal, not some soft settlement girl playing mountain woman." "I appreciate that," Mara said dryly. "I think." A cry came from the basket, and Winter woke up angry about it. Mara excused herself and retrieved the baby, who immediately stopped fussing when she was picked up. Ruth's face softened when she saw the child. "Well now, aren't you a fierce little thing?" "Her name's Winter," Mara said, "and fierce is the right word for her." "May I?" Ruth asked, extending her arms. Mara handed over the baby, watching carefully, but Winter took to Ruth immediately. The older woman held her with practiced ease, making nonsense sounds that had Winter gurgling with delight. "I had 5 of my own," Ruth said. 4 boys and a girl. 3 made it to adulthood. The mountains take their share, but so does everywhere else. At least up here, you know what you're fighting. It was a bleak assessment delivered with matter-of-fact acceptance, and Mara understood it completely. This was the reality of frontier life. You loved hard and lost hard and kept going anyway. They stayed for a few hours, and Ruth caught Mara up on the news from the trading post and the scattered families in the region. One couple had lost their cabin to fire. Another had packed up and moved back east after a single winter. A new family had arrived from Missouri, completely unprepared and unlikely to survive. "Territory's always churning," Ruth said. "People come thinking they want freedom and discover they actually want convenience. The ones who stay are the ones who understand the difference." When they finally left, Ruth pulled Mara aside. "You ever need anything? Help with the baby, medical supplies, just someone to talk to who isn't your husband? You send word. We look out for each other up here. Have to." "Thank you," Mara said, and meant it. The isolation was still hard sometimes, and knowing there were other women within reach made it more bearable. Caleb returned that evening to find Mara telling Winter about the visitors. The baby didn't understand, but she listened with grave attention anyway. Ruth came by, Mara said when he walked in, with her sons. Caleb set down his pack, immediately alert. Everything all right? Fine, just being neighborly. She wanted to meet Winter and make sure we were still alive. Are we? Caleb asked with a tired smile. Last I checked, Mara said. How was the line? Productive. 3 marten, a fox, and a beaver. Not bad for summer trapping. He crossed to where Mara sat with Winter and dropped a kiss on both their heads, a habit he'd developed that still made Mara's chest tight every time. I like coming home to this. To what? To you waiting. To someone caring if I make it back. He settled beside them. I spent 8 years where nobody knew if I lived or died. This is better. The simple honesty of it struck Mara. They'd both been alone in different ways before finding each other, and now neither of them took this connection for granted. Summer passed in a blur of work and growth. Winter started crawling properly, then pulling herself up on furniture, always on the verge of walking. Mara and Caleb worked the trap lines together now, taking turns carrying the baby in a sling Mara had fashioned from leather and cloth. It was harder with a child, but they managed. In August, a letter arrived with a supply trader. It was from Thomas, written in his careful script, and Mara read it by the fire that night. Her father wrote that Catherine's health was declining. Nothing immediately dangerous, but enough to slow her down. Lydia had married her merchant and moved to St. Louis, where she seemed content if not particularly happy. The trading post was struggling, and Thomas was considering selling it to retire somewhere less demanding. He sounds tired, Mara said, passing the letter to Caleb. He's earned tired, Caleb said after reading. That kind of work wears you down. What do you want to do? About what? If he needs help, we could... No, Mara said firmly. I love my father, but that's not my life anymore. I can't go back to being who I was there. I didn't say go back, Caleb said. I said help. There's a difference. Mara considered it. I'll write him. Offer what support we can from here. But I'm not leaving the mountain. Good, Caleb said. Because I'm not either. What? Mara wrote back. A long letter explaining their life and offering financial help if Thomas needed it. She described Winter in detail, shared stories of their survival, and told her father that she'd finally found where she belonged. She didn't know if he'd understand, but she needed him to know. Fall arrived with its usual violence, temperatures dropping fast and leaves turning brilliant colors before being stripped away by wind. They prepared for their third winter with the efficiency of people who'd done this before and survived. The woodpile grew, the larder filled, and the cabin was sealed tight against the coming cold. Winter, the season and the child, came together that year. By the time the first serious snow fell in October, baby Winter was taking her first steps, tottering between Mara and Caleb with fierce determination. She's walking too early, Mara fretted. What if she falls? She's supposed to fall, Caleb said, watching their daughter wobble across the floor. That's how she learns. Winter fell, landing hard on her bottom, and immediately started crying. Caleb scooped her up, checked for actual injury, and when he found none, set her back on her feet. Try again, he told her. And she did. Over and over, falling and getting back up with the kind of stubborn persistence she'd inherited from both parents. She's going to be trouble, Mara said. Already is, Caleb agreed, but his voice was full of pride. The third winter was different from the first two. They knew what to expect now, knew how to pace themselves, knew the rhythm of survival. And with Winter to care for, the isolation felt less oppressive. There was always something to do, someone to attend to, a reason to keep moving forward. One particularly brutal evening in January, with wind howling outside and the fire roaring, Caleb looked up from the wooden toy he was carving for Winter. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Mara glanced up from mending clothes. Regret what? This. All of it. Leaving civilization, marrying me, ending up here. He gestured around the cabin. It's not an easy life. No, Mara agreed. It's not easy. But easy isn't what I wanted. What did you want? Mara thought about it, trying to find words for something she'd barely understood herself at the time. I wanted to matter. I wanted someone to see me as more than just useful.
I wanted to build something that was mine. She looked at him directly. I got all of that. So no, I don't regret it. Even the hard parts? Especially the hard parts, Mara said. The hard parts are what made me who I am now. I'm stronger because of them. You were always strong, Caleb said. You just didn't know it. Maybe, Mara conceded, but I know it now. That matters. Winter, sitting on the floor with wooden blocks Caleb had made, babbled something that sounded almost like words. They both turned to watch her, the small person they'd created, and the moment felt perfect in its ordinariness. In March, when the snows started to melt and the world began to thaw, a rider came up the trail. It was one of Ruth's sons, Sam, Mara thought, and his face was grim. It's Ma, he said without preamble. She's sick. Bad sick. We need help. Mara looked at Caleb, a silent conversation passing between them. Then she turned to Sam. I'll come. They left within the hour, Caleb staying with Winter while Mara rode out with Sam. The 15 miles to Ruth's cabin felt longer in the mud and slush of early spring, but they made it by nightfall. Ruth was in bad shape. Fever, rattling cough, struggling to breathe. Mara had seen this before, pneumonia, probably, the kind that killed more people on the frontier than anything else. She spent 3 days nursing Ruth, using everything she'd learned from the medical guide and her own experience. She kept the fever down with cool cloths, forced fluids when Ruth could swallow, and sat up through the nights monitoring her breathing. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Ruth woke clear-headed for the first time, looked at Mara sitting beside her bed, and managed a weak smile. You stayed, she said, her voice raspy. Of course I stayed, Mara said. You told me we look out for each other. Most people just say that, Ruth said. They don't mean it when it's inconvenient. I meant it, Mara said. Ruth squeezed her hand with what little strength she had. You're one of us now, really one of us, not just someone passing through. The words shouldn't have meant as much as they did, but Mara felt them settle in her chest like a weight. Community, belonging, things she'd never really had before. She stayed 2 more days until Ruth was strong enough to manage on her own, then rode home to find Caleb and Winter waiting for her. The baby had missed her, clinging to Mara and refusing to be set down for hours, and even Caleb seemed relieved to have her back. How is she? He asked. She'll live, Mara said. Tough old woman. Takes one to know one, Caleb said with a hint of a smile. Spring fully arrived, bringing with it the chaos of renewal. The trap lines had to be checked and reset for the summer season. The garden needed planting. Repairs from winter damage demanded attention. And Winter was walking everywhere now, getting into everything, requiring constant supervision. They hired help that summer, a young man named Daniel who was trying to learn the trade. He was green and awkward and made every mistake possible, but he was willing to work and eager to learn. Caleb taught him patiently, and Mara watched her husband transform into a teacher, passing on knowledge the same way it had been passed to him. In July, they made another trip to Fort Bridger. Thomas had written that he was indeed selling the trading post, and Mara wanted to see him before he left. The fort was busier than she remembered, crowded with summer traffic. But Thomas was easy to find, still working the store with the same methodical dedication he'd always shown. He looked older, grayer, more worn down. But his face lit up when he saw Mara, and especially when he saw Winter, who was now a toddling, babbling force of nature. She looks like you, Thomas said, holding his granddaughter with gentle hands. Same stubborn chin. She acts like both of us, Mara said, which means we're in trouble when she gets older. Catherine appeared from the back room, moving slower than Mara remembered. Her mother had aged too, the sharp edges softened by illness and time. She looked at Mara with something that might have been regret. You came, Catherine said. Of course I came, Mara replied. You're still my mother. They didn't hug. That bridge was still too damaged to cross completely, but they sat together and talked, awkward and halting, about the years that had passed and the lives they'd lived separately. I was wrong about many things, Catherine said finally. About you. About what you could do. About what strength looks like. She looked at Winter, playing with wooden blocks on the floor. You built something real, Mara. Something that lasts. It was the closest Catherine would ever come to an apology, and Mara accepted it for what it was. Where will you go? Mara asked. After you sell the post? St. Louis, Thomas said, to be near Lydia. She's expecting her first child, and she asked if we'd come. How is she? Mara asked, realizing she genuinely wanted to know. Different, Catherine said. Quieter. Less certain of herself. Marriage didn't give her what she thought it would. What did she think it would give her? Purpose, Catherine said. Meaning. All the things you found, and she's still searching for. There was a strange symmetry to it. Lydia had gotten the respectable marriage and comfortable life, but she'd lost something in the process. Mara had gotten hardship and isolation, but she'd gained everything that mattered. They spent 3 days at the fort, and when it was time to leave, Thomas pulled Mara aside. I'm proud of you, he said, the same words he'd spoken before she left, but they meant more now. You took the hard path and made it work. That takes courage. I had good teachers, Mara said. You taught me to work. Caleb taught me to survive. And Winter's teaching me everything else. Thomas hugged her tight. Take care of your family. I will, Mara promised. The ride home felt different this time. Mara wasn't running from anything anymore. She was riding toward something. A life she'd chosen. A family she'd built. A home that was entirely hers. Caleb was waiting when they crested the final ridge. He'd seen them coming and had walked out to meet them, and the sight of him standing there against the backdrop of their mountain made Mara's throat tight. Welcome home, he said when they reached him. Good to be home, Mara replied. Summer faded into fall, and with it came the preparations for their 4th winter. But this time, they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The cabin had been expanded, adding a small room for Winter. The larder was fuller than ever. They'd saved enough from their furs to buy luxuries, real coffee, sugar, even a few books. Daniel decided to stay on, building his own small cabin on the edge of their property and learning the trade seriously. It meant Caleb had help with the harder work, which meant more time with family. Ruth recovered fully and became a regular visitor, often bringing her sons and their families. The isolation that had nearly broken Mara in that first winter now felt like chosen solitude rather than forced exile. One October evening, with Winter asleep in her room and the first snow beginning to fall outside, Mara and Caleb sat by the fire with cups of coffee. Do you think she'll stay here when she's grown? Mara asked, watching the snow through the window. Winter? Who else? Mara smiled. She's growing up in this wilderness. Will she love it like we do, or will she run from it? Don't know, Caleb said honestly. Can't predict what she'll want. All we can do is raise her to be strong enough to choose for herself. Like you did for me, Mara said. Caleb looked at her, surprised. I didn't do anything. You saw me, Mara said. Really saw me. Not the version everyone else wanted me to be, but who I actually was. That gave me the courage to choose. You always had the courage, Caleb said. You just needed someone to notice it. They sat in comfortable silence, years of shared struggle and shared joy woven between them like a tapestry. Outside, the snow fell steadily, blanketing their mountain in white. Inside, their daughter slept safely in her bed, dreaming whatever dreams children dream. I love this life, Mara said quietly. I love you. I love what we've built here. I love you too, Caleb said, and it was easier now than it had been that first time by the creek. Practice had made vulnerability less terrifying. I love all of it. Winter came in full force that year, hard and cold and relentless. But they weathered it together, the 3 of them, with Daniel nearby and Ruth's family a few hours' ride away. The isolation existed, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of purpose and connection and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. Spring arrived eventually, the way it always did. The snow melted, the world turned green, and life continued its endless cycle of renewal and growth. On a warm day in May, Mara stood outside the cabin watching Winter, who was now nearly 2, chase a butterfly through the wildflowers that had bloomed overnight. Caleb was repairing a fence nearby, and the sound of his hammer striking wood was rhythmic and familiar. This was her life now.
Not the life she'd been born to, not the life anyone had expected for her, but the life she'd chosen and fought for and earned through blood and sweat and sheer determination. She wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't overlooked or undervalued or taken for granted. She was Mara Draven, wife to a mountain man, mother to a fierce daughter, survivor of winters that would have broken most people, builder of a life that meant something. And she was happy, not in the effortless, uncomplicated way of fairy tales, but in the hard-won, deeply satisfying way that came from overcoming obstacles and proving wrong everyone who doubted her. Caleb finished with the fence and walked over, slipping an arm around her waist as they watched their daughter play. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how different everything is," Mara said. "From that first night at the fort to now, it feels like a lifetime ago." "It was a lifetime ago," Caleb said. "We're different people now." "Better people?" "Better for each other," Caleb said. "That's what matters." Winter ran over then, grabbing Mara's skirt with sticky hands and demanding to be picked up. Mara lifted her daughter, settling the girl on her hip, and felt the completeness of the moment. This was what she'd been searching for all those years. Not comfort or ease or the approval of others, but this, connection, purpose, the bone-deep knowledge that she mattered. Caleb had chosen her when no one else had, but more importantly, she'd chosen herself. She'd chosen strength over beauty, struggle over ease, authenticity over performance. And in making those choices, she'd discovered who she really was. The mountains stretched before them, vast and wild and unforgiving, but it was theirs. They'd claimed it through survival, through perseverance, through the simple act of refusing to give up when everything was hard. "Tell me again," Mara said, looking at Caleb. "Tell me why you chose me." He'd answered this question before, but she never tired of hearing it. "Because you were real," Caleb said. "Because you worked without complaining. Because you had strength that nobody else saw. Because I looked at you and knew you could survive anything." He paused, then added, "And because something in me recognized something in you, like calling to like." "And now?" Mara asked. "Would you still choose me?" "Every day," Caleb said without hesitation. "Every single day, I'd choose you all over again." Winter squirmed in Mara's arms, wanting down, wanting to run, wanting to explore the world with the fearless enthusiasm of a child who'd never been told she couldn't. Mara set her daughter down and watched her go, knowing that Winter would grow up different from other girls. She'd grow up knowing she was strong, knowing she was capable, knowing that her worth wasn't determined by her appearance or her compliance or anyone else's opinion. She'd grow up the way Mara wished she had, free. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Caleb took Mara's hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice, and they stood together watching the day end. "We did good," Caleb said. "We did," Mara agreed. They'd started as strangers, become partners, evolved into lovers, and somewhere along the way they'd built a family that was stronger than either of them alone. The forgotten daughter had found her place. The mountain man had found his home. And together, they'd created something that would outlast them both. A legacy of strength and survival and the stubborn refusal to accept limits. In a harsh Wyoming frontier where only the strong endured, they hadn't just survived, they'd thrived. And that made all the difference.